One film on this list lost so much money, the director didn't work in Hollywood for nearly a decade. Another was literally pulled from theaters after 3 days. And one was considered such a creative disaster that the studio buried it, only for a new generation to call it a masterpiece 30 years later. These aren't forgotten failures. They're cult legends. Films that confused 1960s audiences so badly they tanked at the box office, but eventually changed cinema forever. The question isn't why they failed. It's how films this bold, this strange, this ahead of their time even got made in the first place. And one of them on this list? It wasn't just a flop, it was a scandal that nearly ended multiple careers, and it's now taught in film schools as essential viewing. Here's what qualifies a film for this list. First, it had to genuinely bomb during its original theatrical release in the 1960s, not underperform, not mixed results. We're talking financial disasters, studio panic, or films yanked from distribution. Second, it had to achieve cult status later, meaning passionate fan communities, critical reappraisals, midnight screenings, home video redemption, or direct influence on major filmmakers who cited it as foundational. Third, the gap between failure and legend has to tell us something. These aren't just misunderstood movies. They're time capsules that reveal how audiences, studios, and critics in the 1960s couldn't process what they were seeing. Why does this matter? Because the 1960s were a war zone for cinema. The old Hollywood system was collapsing, censorship codes were weakening, international films were flooding art houses, audiences were fragmenting, and a generation of directors were making films for the next decade, not the one they were living in. These 10 films paid the price for being early. They confused middle America. They alienated traditional moviegoers. They broke tonal rules that hadn't even been written yet. But here's the pattern you'll see. Every single one of these films trusted the audience to think, to feel uncomfortable, to question what a movie could be. And 1960s ticket buyers weren't ready. The generation that came after, they were obsessed. By the end of this list, you'll see exactly which risks killed these films in 1960s theaters, and why those same risks made them immortal. Year 10, Petulia, 1968. Picture this. You're a studio executive in 1968. You've just watched a romantic drama that refuses to tell its story in order. Scenes don't connect. Time jumps backward and forward without warning. The love story feels cold. The San Francisco setting is shot like a nightmare. That was Petulia, directed by Richard Lester right after his massive success with the Beatles films. Warner Brothers expected a hit. They got a box office disaster that barely registered outside a few major cities. The bet was bold. Apply French New Wave editing techniques to an American relationship drama. The crash was predictable. Audiences in 1968 wanted The Graduate or Bonnie and Clyde. Clear emotion, clear stakes. Petulia gave them a divorced surgeon, a manic pixie wife trapped in an abusive marriage, and a structure that felt like memory itself. Critics were split, audiences stayed away, the film vanished. But by the 1990s, directors like Paul Thomas Anderson and Steven Soderbergh were citing Petulia as one of the most formally daring American films of its era. The non-linear storytelling that confused 1968 crowds. It became the template for indie relationship dramas. Why it belongs here? It bombed because it told a love story like a puzzle, and 1960s audiences wanted clarity. The lesson? Formal experimentation without emotional safety nets will always alienate mass audiences first and inspire filmmakers later. And the next entry proves that even horror legends can miscalculate what scares people. 9. The Sorcerers, 1967. Michael Reeves directed 3 films before dying tragically at 25. The Sorcerers was his second, a British psychological horror film about an elderly couple using a mind control device to experience youth through a young man. The concept was ahead of its time. Body horror meets technology paranoia. But British audiences in 1967 were deep into Hammer Gothic, castles, vampires, period pieces. The Sorcerers gave them Maud London, nightclubs, and Boris Karloff as a sad scientist conducting unethical experiments. The film opened quietly, earned respectful but confused reviews, and disappeared within weeks. Reeves would make Witchfinder General the next year, his masterpiece. But The Sorcerers was treated as a minor curiosity. Decades later, it's recognized as Proto-Cronenberg, a horror film about the violence of vicarious experience. The mind control scenes feel like a direct ancestor to Videodrome and Strange Days. Why it belongs here? It imagined technology-driven body horror 15 years before the genre had a name. The lesson: being early to a subgenre means you might not live to see it catch on. The next one wasn't just early. It was practically from another dimension. 8. The Naked Kiss, 1964. Samuel Fuller opens this film with a brutal fight scene. A bald woman beating a man with her purse, ripping off her wig, screaming. It's shot in jarring close-ups. It's visceral. It's ugly. Then, the film jumps forward and becomes a melodrama about a former sex worker trying to build a quiet life in a small town, only to discover the town's most respected citizen is a predator. The Naked Kiss opened in 1964 and confused everyone. Was it an exploitation film? A serious drama? The tonal whiplash was too much. Audiences didn't show up. Critics dismissed it as tasteless. But Fuller had made something genuinely subversive. A film that weaponized genre tropes to talk about sexual trauma, moral hypocrisy, and the violence lurking under American small-town respectability. By the 1980s, The Naked Kiss was a midnight movie staple. By the 2000s, it was in the Criterion Collection. The opening scene, once considered cheap shock tactics, is now taught as one of the most audacious film openings of the 1960s. Why it belongs here? It treated exploitation material with the seriousness of European art cinema, and no one knew how to market that. The lesson: mixing low and high cinema only works if your audience is ready to be unsettled. And speaking of unsettling, the next film didn't just confuse audiences, it enraged them. 7. The Pawnbroker, 1964. Sidney Lumet directed this story of a Holocaust survivor running a Harlem pawn shop, haunted by memories of concentration camps. It was shot in stark black and white. It refused to sentimentalize trauma, and it contained brief nudity, radical for 1964 American cinema. The film fought censorship battles before release. When it finally opened, it played mostly in art houses. Mainstream audiences avoided it. The subject matter, Holocaust memory intersecting with urban poverty, was too heavy, too angry, too raw. Rod Steiger's performance as the pawnbroker is a study in emotional shutdown. He's numb, cruel, unreachable. There's no catharsis, no redemption arc that feels earned. The film ends on a note of ambiguous pain. 1964 audiences wanted Mary Poppins and My Fair Lady. The Pawnbroker was the opposite of escapism. But by the 1970s, every American auteur making films about trauma and urban decay was citing The Pawnbroker. Scorsese, Friedkin, Lumet's own later work, they all learned from this film's refusal to comfort viewers. Why it belongs here? It depicted trauma with such clinical honesty that 1960s audiences felt punished, not moved. The lesson: films that refuse emotional release will always struggle commercially, but they'll teach the next generation how to tell hard truths. The pattern is forming. You see it, right? These films didn't fail because they were bad. They failed because they were early. And the next one might be the most tragically early film on this list. 6. The Crimson Kimono, 1959-1960. Technically released at the tail end of 1959, but widely seen in 1960, Samuel Fuller's The Crimson Kimono is a Los Angeles noir about two detectives, one white, one Japanese American, who both fall for the same woman during a murder investigation. The twist? The film treats the Japanese American detective as the romantic lead. It interrogates racism directly. It was shot on location in LA's Little Tokyo with primarily Asian American actors in supporting roles, almost unheard of for 1959. The film opened to empty theaters. Some southern markets refused to book it. Critics called it preachy. Audiences expecting a standard noir procedural were baffled by the film's actual subject, internalized racism and friendship destroyed by jealousy. Fuller had made a film about racial anxiety that was 15 years ahead of the conversation. It bombed. Decades later, it's studied as a landmark, one of the first Hollywood films to center an Asian American romantic lead and to explore how racism poisons intimacy between friends. Why it belongs here? It asked 1960 audiences to care about racism in a genre that was supposed to be about guns and dames. The lesson: social consciousness in genre film only works when the culture is ready to hear it. And if you think that's the most misunderstood Fuller film on this list, wait until you hear about the next one. 5. Targets, 1968. Peter Bogdanovich's directorial debut is a horror film about horror becoming obsolete. It's a cheap Roger Corman production that accidentally became one of the most chilling films about American violence ever made. The premise: an aging horror star, played by Boris Karloff, essentially playing himself, is retiring because he believes monsters aren't scary anymore. Meanwhile, a clean-cut suburban boy stockpiles guns and starts shooting strangers. Targets opened in August 1968, just months after the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. America was traumatized. The last thing audiences wanted was a film about random mass violence. Paramount barely promoted it. It played a handful of theaters and vanished. Critics who saw it were shaken but unsure how to write about it. But Bogdanovich had made something genuinely prophetic, a film arguing that real-world violence had made fictional monsters irrelevant. The sniper sequence, shot with cold, documentary precision, feels more disturbing today than almost any horror film of its era. Why It Belongs Here. It depicted the horror of random violence with such unflinching realism that traumatized 1968 audiences rejected it. The lesson? Films that capture a cultural wound too soon will be avoided, not embraced. And the next film didn't just wound audiences, it scandalized them. 4. Seconds, 1966. John Frankenheimer's Seconds is a science fiction nightmare about a middle-aged man who fakes his death and gets a new body, only to discover his new life is just as empty as his old one. The film is shot like a paranoid fever dream. Distorted lenses, extreme close-ups, a Saul Bass opening title sequence designed to disorient, and a third act that spirals into existential horror. Paramount released it in 1966, expecting a modest thriller. What they got was one of the most formally aggressive and emotionally punishing films of the decade. Audiences walked out. The box office was disastrous. Frankenheimer's career cooled for years. Critics dismissed it as pretentious, but Seconds had done something radical. It used science fiction to eviscerate the American dream. The horror isn't the body swap procedure. It's realizing you hate yourself no matter what you look like. By the 1980s, Seconds was a cult masterpiece. By the 2000s, it was recognized as one of the great American science fiction films, a direct ancestor to Total Recall, The Matrix, and every film about identity as a prison. Why It Belongs Here. It turned a pulp premise into a philosophical nightmare, and 1960s audiences wanted escapism, not mirrors. The lesson: science fiction about self-loathing will always terrify audiences more than monsters. The pattern is clear now. Every film on this list did something the 1960s couldn't process, and we're about to hit the 3 entries that didn't just confuse audiences, they nearly destroyed careers. The 3. Performance, 1970, shot in 1968. Okay, this one technically premiered in 1970, but it was shot in 1968, and the studio panic started immediately. Nicholas Roeg and Donald Cammell's performance is a British gangster film that mutates into a psychedelic identity crisis halfway through. A violent enforcer on the run hides in the home of a reclusive rock star. What follows is a hallucinogenic exploration of masculinity, violence, sexuality, and ego dissolution. Mick Jagger plays the rock star. The film includes gender fluidity, drug use, and graphic violence edited like a nightmare. Warner Brothers executives reportedly walked out of the first screening. The film sat on a shelf for 2 years while the studio tried to figure out what to do with it. When it finally limped into theaters in 1970, it bombed. Critics were hostile. Audiences were baffled. But Performance became the ultimate midnight movie. It was too strange, too sexual, too philosophically ambitious to work as mainstream entertainment. But it was catnip for film students, cinephiles, and anyone interested in cinema as pure sensory experience. Roeg went on to make Don't Look Now and The Man Who Fell to Earth. Cammell's career never recovered. But Performance endured as a cult legend. Why It Belongs Here. It took the gangster genre and drowned it in philosophy and psychedelia, a tonal gamble no 1960s audience was prepared for. The lesson: films that dissolve genre boundaries mid-story will confuse everyone except the audience that doesn't care about genre in the first place. And if performance was too weird, the next film was too honest. 2. Mickey 1, 1965. Arthur Penn followed The Miracle Worker with this, a paranoid art film about a nightclub comedian running from mobsters, shot like French New Wave fever dream with jazz score and zero narrative clarity. Warren Beatty stars as a comic who may or may not actually be in danger. The film refuses to explain. Is the threat real? Is it guilt? Is it existential? Penn won't tell you. Columbia Pictures released Mickey 1 in 1965, hoping to capitalize on European art cinema trends. Instead, they got one of the most financially disastrous releases of the decade. Critics were split between admiration and bafflement. Audiences ignored it entirely. Penn had made an American film in the style of Godard and Truffaut: jump cuts, jazz, paranoia, ambiguity. But American audiences in 1965 weren't ready for Hollywood stars in films that refused to resolve. Decades later, Mickey 1 is recognized as one of the boldest American experiments of the 1960s. It's the film that taught Penn how to make Bonnie and Clyde 2 years later, a film that used similar techniques but gave audiences a clear emotional arc. Why it belongs here. It imported European art cinema techniques without providing the narrative safety net American audiences needed. The lesson? Formal radicalism works in Hollywood only when wrapped in emotional accessibility. And the number one slot? It's a film so misunderstood, so financially catastrophic, and so culturally important that it defines this entire list. B1. Two-Lane Blacktop, 1971. Universal Pictures was so confident in Two-Lane Blacktop they put the script on the cover of Esquire magazine before the film was even finished. The headline: Our nomination for Movie of the Year. The film? A minimalist road movie about two drifters racing a Pontiac GTO across America. Almost no dialogue, no backstory, no character names. Musicians James Taylor and Dennis Wilson play the leads with zero charisma by design. The film ends mid-shot. The frame literally burns up in the projector. Two-Lane Blacktop opened in 1971 and died immediately. Audiences expecting car chase excitement got meditation on alienation and masculinity in decay. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Universal buried it. Director Monte Hellman had made an anti-road movie, a film that used the iconography of American freedom to explore emptiness. The characters drift without purpose. The race doesn't matter. The journey leads nowhere. It was too slow, too opaque, too existential. 1971 audiences rejected it. The French Connection and Dirty Harry dominated the box office that year. Films with clear heroes, clear stakes, clear emotion. But Two-Lane Blacktop became the cult film. By the 1980s, it was a midnight movie legend. By the 2000s, it was in the Criterion Collection. Filmmakers like Wim Wenders, Jim Jarmusch, and Kelly Reichardt cited as foundational, the film that proved you could make cinema out of silence and landscape. Why it belongs here. It removed every element that makes road movies entertaining and replaced them with emptiness, a bold artistic choice that guaranteed commercial failure. The lesson? Films that meditate on absence instead of presence will always lose audiences trained on narrative momentum. Here's what every film on this list has in common. They were made by directors who didn't care if you understood them in 1966 or 1968 or 1970. They were making films for the future, for audiences who didn't exist yet. The 1960s were a transition decade. Old Hollywood was dying, censorship was collapsing, audiences were fragmenting, and these 10 filmmakers saw the chaos and made a bet that cinema could be stranger, slower, harder, more ambiguous. They lost the bet in theaters, but they won in history. Every single one of these films influenced the filmmakers who came next. Petulia taught indie directors how to fracture time. Seconds taught sci-fi filmmakers how to make paranoia visceral. Two-Lane Blacktop taught a generation that silence could be cinema. The 1960s audience rejected them because they wanted clarity, escape, emotion. These films offered mystery, discomfort, philosophy. But here's the truth. Cult status isn't just about rediscovery. It's about a film finding its right audience, even if that audience doesn't exist for 20 years. These 10 films didn't fail. They were just early. So what's the takeaway? Bombing at the box office doesn't mean you made a bad film. Sometimes it means you made a film for a world that hasn't arrived yet. If you want more, if you want to see how this same pattern played out in the 1970s with even bigger budgets and even more spectacular disasters, drop a comment. Because the 1970s, that's when cult bomb filmmaking became an entire movement. And if you're wondering which of these 10 films you should watch first, start with Two Lane Blacktop. It's the purest distillation of everything this list is about. A film so committed to its vision that it refused to meet audiences halfway. That refusal? That's what made it immortal.